Okay, everyone, if you could please take your seats for our next speaker. We'll wait till everybody quiets down a little bit. Thank you for your attention. All right, we're going to move on with our next speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Colin Thorne, Emeritus Chair of Physical Geography and Senior River Scientist with the University of Nottingham and also with Wolf Water Resources. Dr. Colin Thorne.
Good morning, everybody. I'm proud to be here to speak to you this morning, and my topic that I was assigned was about rebalancing connectivity in the Riverscape, essentially putting beaver into the wider context of rivers and their management. But actually, I'm going to do something quite a lot more exciting than that, or I hope so, because what we're going to do in the next 25 minutes is go on a journey to the Beaverscape and beyond. So the term Beaverscape has been in common usage in the river restoration community and wider for quite some time. For example, in the famous book Eager, Gofarb says that ours was once a beaverscape, so familiar to Native Americans, where land was blended with water and unwary European travelers had their footwear slipped off. And more recently, Beaverscapes is a user group, interest group on TikTok. So it's pretty current and pretty fashionable in social media too. And I'm not recommending this group, by the way. I'm not endorsing them. If you visit the site, you'll see why. But Beaverscape as a word, what does it actually mean? You know, we use it, but do we understand exactly what it means? So the etymology is pretty simple. Beaver, a large semi-aquatic broad-tailed rodent native to North America and Eurasia, we all know that. And scape is a combining form extracted from the word landscape, which we all do know, and denoting an extensive view, the scenery, or a pictorial representation of such a view as specified by the initial element, the land, or indeed the beaver. And there's lots of other examples of scapes floating around these days. So seascape, cityscape, even moonscape are terms that are in common usage. So that takes us then to, well, what is a landscape? And a landscape generally may be a depiction of a natural scenery that includes mountains and valleys and rivers and forests and animals, and sometimes even people and buildings. And it usually provides a wide view or a vista. And the elements that make up the landscape are arranged or sometimes rearranged to give a well-ordered, coherent view of the elements of the landscape. So the landscapes are often composed rather than real. And in fact, whilst a landscape may simply be a photograph or a representation of a landscape, those sorts of landscapes are not as highly regarded as the landscapes that are more imagined, but which are better able to capture not only the factual content of the landscape, but also its grandeur, also its heritage, its dignity, in a way that not only informs the viewer, but also inspires them and perhaps puts them in awe and appreciation of the landscape that they're looking at. So as a case in point, when the first geological investigation of Yellowstone was made in 1871, the team included William Henry Jackson, a photographer who was there to record the landscape and take it back to the people back on the East Coast. And this is one of the pictures taken by Jackson, and it is indeed a very faithful view of the lower falls on the Yellowstone River. And yet, the artist who was along, Moran, painted pictorial landscapes that were far grander and which Nathaniel P. Langford said captured the majestic harmony in the whole in a way that he'd never seen before in nature's grandest works. And it turns out that this picture, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, was far more influential than the photographs, even though this is not a pictorial representation. Actually, it's a composite of several different views of that landscape. So the fact it's not faithful to the true reality is subsumed because it communicates much better what that landscape is and why it's important. In fact, it resulted not only in this area, which was formerly known as Coulter's Hell, being transformed into a really strong, popular tourist destination and regarded as a wonderland, but it also influenced Congress in passing the act that formed the first national park in the United States of America. And Congress purchased this portrait of the landscape to celebrate the passing of that legislation. So you can see how a scape can do much more than just represent what you'd see if you stood at a particular spot in the landscape. So it follows from that then that a beaverscape can of course just be a picture of a river that's been modulated by the action of beaver, like this one taken by Dr. Emily Fairfax. And that communicates quite a lot. But a beaverscape could also be something like this imagined beaverscape put together by Rewilding Europe, which shows not only a representation of the beaverscape, but also communicates to the viewer a lot of useful information about what beaver actually do and why beaverscapes are important and valuable. And possibly this kind of rendition then is going to be more influential. It's more likely to impress and inspire the viewers and perhaps make them more likely to support beaver recolonization or reintroduction. So that's why getting really good versions of beaverscapes, written and pictorial, real and imagined, is a really good thing to do. But why do I say then that we have to go beyond the beaverscape? And that's because a beaverscape cannot be created or sustained in isolation. It's intimately and inextricably linked to other scapes. For example, let's take the landscape as the most obvious example of that, because the beaverscape influences the landscape, and the landscape certainly influences the beaverscape. As we see in this poster from the US Geological Survey, if a pristine landscape is urbanized, that can be catastrophic, not only for the whole ecosystem, but for any beaverscapes that are included in it. Conversely, if beavers start to colonize in a cityscape, in a developed area, then they can cause problems with conventional drainage systems that aren't intended to cope with that kind of perturbation. And that often leads to beavers being trapped out from urban areas. So you can see the link then between the landscape and the beaverscape. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because, for example, in the city of Tigard, the Fano Creek was restored during the 2010s very successfully, to the point that beaver recolonized. They weren't introduced, they recolonized, including a 1-mile stretch where the river runs alongside the Fano Creek Trail. And crossings like this one were compromised by the backwater effect of the beaver ponds at high flows. And even at low flows, there was so much mud on the path that it was unsafe for cyclists. Now, if you mess with cyclists in Oregon, you're going to get big blowback. And so very quickly then the city of Tigard said, we'll get rid of the beavers because they're clearly messing up the cycling path. It's very, very popular. However, public opinion then rose and said, no, we don't want the beavers to go away. We value the ecosystem and the social economic benefits that we're getting from the beaver. We want to keep them. And so as this article in the Bike Portland website said, basically the beavers won. The entire crossing and several other locations were reworked to allow the beaver to continue to occupy that stream. So that connection between the landscape and the beaverscape isn't just a physical connection, it's also moderated by the views and attitudes of the people who live in the area, which is represented by the culturescape. And so we can see that there's actually an intermediate there, that the landscape is filtered through the culturescape in its impacts on the beaverscape. And my thesis, and what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time this morning, is that there are actually several other scapes that also interpose between the beaverscape and the landscape. And I'll explain what they are, hopefully convince you I'm not making this up. These are actual things that exist and that we should maybe take into account when we're trying to recreate or sustain beaverscapes. So starting with the culturescape. What is a culturescape? Well, a culturescape is an exposition of the values of the people who live in the landscape and how they've modified that landscape over the years. And so landscapes, by and large, reflect the actions of the people who live there and become culturescapes, become part of the culturescape, if you like, the base medium on which the culturescape is formed. And there's a rich literature on culturescapes, explorations in culturescapes, this book being just one example. Now, this is important because the original culturescapes of a region are those impressed upon it by the indigenous people of that region. And those kinds of culturescapes tend to be very close to nature, and they go back to time immemorial. To the extent that the National Park Service is charged with understanding and preserving culturescapes from past generations in order that future generations can understand how the culturescape got here and for good or ill. The culturescapes then are overlain on each other. And if we look at the culturescapes of the US today, then you can see that. If you're close enough to read some of these, you'll see there are specific references to indigenous peoples in some of them and not in others, where that culturescape has been completely buried by the modern culturescape. But a region's cultural identity, that's what's responsible for its culturescape, depends on the behaviors of its people and the meanings that they attach to those behaviors. So the cultural identity then reflects the community's vision and values and beliefs, ethnicities, traits, self-image, lifestyles, and governance. And we see that the USA's culturescapes are extremely varied, and they reflect all of those traits of the populations of the different regions. And they also reflect the value and the way that people treat the impacted landscape that they inherit from their forebears. So the good news is that any culturescape can be bettered, but it's not easy. And scientific information and technical data don't usually change a culturescape. They're not sufficient in themselves. Changing the culturescape requires that, first, individuals become culturally aware and empowered. And basically, they have to realize that they are the change that they wish to see, because otherwise, nothing will actually happen. And secondly, those enlightened peoples, those aware people, have to be willing to challenge belief systems, push boundaries, disrupt orthodoxies, and overcome numerous social and institutional barriers to innovation and betterment of the culturescape. But once again, the good news is there are demonstrable examples of that happening in different regions of the USA, and we've heard about several of them already this week. So looking at the naturescape, what the heck is naturescape? So naturescape is a result of naturescaping. And the properties of any culturescape depend on the natural landscape and, as I say, what society wants from that landscape. And in the US these days, what many people want is to live and work more sustainably and closer to nature. And this has led to the emergence of this new form of cityscape and landscape management termed naturescaping. Naturescaping takes several of its principles from the US Environment Protection Agency's greenscaping and beneficial landscaping programs, again, which are real things that are working today. And those approaches that EPA are promulgating strive to reduce water use, energy use, and the use of chemicals in the natural environment. So naturescaping is a method of advanced land and natural resource management that not only allows people in nature to coexist, but leverages the power of nature to create public goods, social goods, economic goods, and to make businesses and farms and ranches more viable. So broadly, what naturescaping aims to do is do things like reduce pest infestations, reduce the prevalence of diseases in plants and animals, and increase profitability on ranches and farms, and livability in cities. The keys here are to stop the environmental degradation and biodiversity collapse that we are currently experiencing, and if possible, reverse it, whilst keeping agricultural businesses viable and vibrant. So the sorts of things you might do are, as we see here, reconnect the floodplain to its river, rehydrate it, get much, much lusher pastures. But also what you might do at the same time is reduce the stocking density so that you don't destroy that landscape, and, crucially, replace domesticated cattle that are heavily reliant on silage and don't do well in bad weather and so on, with native breeds of cattle that are hardier, that can look after themselves better, and which produce premium meat products which increase profitability. So naturescaping is a way not only of living with nature, but also exploiting nature for economic gain. Spongescape is a fairly new one. It really springs, I think, from China and their Sponge Cities program, which has been running for a decade and is revolutionizing how stormwater is managed in Chinese megacities. But Spongescape is actually an EU project headed by Deltares, 15 million euros, and charged with undertaking sponge measures to create spongescapes that have a higher capacity to store stormwater in aquifers, in the soil, and in surface water features. And the aim of the Spongescapes program is to rigorously monitor 3 regional spongescape programs and demonstrate and establish the links between spongescaping and reduced flood risks and reduced drought impacts, in order that that will pave the way to Europe-wide adoption of spongescape approaches. The foodscape is another one that's perhaps not well known to you at all, but the foodscape reflects the fact that the food abundance and food accessibility vary widely across intact, well-connected riverscapes and catchments. That means that the optimum food availability and abundance varies between the tributaries, the main stem, the floodplain, the estuary, and even the near shore zone if you've got an anadromous species. And fish, as mobile consumers, are able to move between these different sources within the foodscape and optimize the balance between the calories they take in from that abundant food source and the calories they burn in having to get to it and eat it. And so research in the Pacific Northwest has shown that for salmon how a rich and diverse foodscape leads to much more diverse life cycle histories for salmon, such that they become much more stable and much less vulnerable to change. A riverscape, like a landscape, has been around for a long, long time. It's a pictorial rendition or a version of a landscape with a river in it. And this one dates from 1590, and again, they can be really beautiful and extremely expressive. But in the context of our work, a riverscape has become a unifying concept that looks at not just the channels and the wetlands and the floodplains, but also the ecosystem architects and the keystone species like beaver that make those riverscapes tick. And so riverscape is now a term to refer to that. But it's not new. 1968, Luna Leopold and Maura O'Brien Marchand wrote how you could quantitatively inventory the riverscape. And in doing so, they showed us that they were way ahead of the curve, because they didn't just look at the physical and chemical character of the riverscape and the biology, but also the human use and interest in that riverscape. And they went on to use the data from their inventories to show how different types of riverscape were of different value and interest to society. And that's another connection. The treescape is an integral part of the beaverscape and the landscape and the riverscape. And we know that treescapes do all kinds of good things for the flows of nutrients, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, and so on and so forth. But that's not just what trees do. And a project in the UK called Connected Treescapes shows the value of treescapes to people. People live better lives when they have trees in them. And trees also help offset the worst impacts of climate change. And so that connectivity of treescapes then goes beyond the physical and the biological. We've heard a lot already this week about fires, and if you like, the pyroscape. And in this Guardian article, it's pointed out that we have deranged pyroscapes. There's actually less fire in area now than there has been at any time since antiquity. But the fires are different. They're distorted, they're weird. They're much more dangerous, they're much more damaging, and they're much less predictable. And the general theory is that as the Earth warms, the risk from fires is going to increase, and generally that's true. But maybe not in valley floors and floodplains, where we know from Emily's work that we can offset those risks with beaverscapes. And more generally, we know from a US-UK study how the behavior of a fire in a valley bottom can be changed depending on the connectivity between the river and its floodplain. So in an unrestored river, we see a rather uniform burn that goes right through the floodplain and maybe just spares that narrow riparian corridor. In a conventionally reconnected river, that's one that only floods maybe 1 year in 2. Then you see benefits, but not as many as if you have a fully reconnected river, floodplain, wetland system, the sort of beaverscapes that we're talking about, where we have, in place of that uniform burn across the valley floor, a burn mosaic, with some areas being spared completely, the pond areas, and some areas burning to a crisp, and everything in between. Not only is the severity of the fire's impacts on the ecosystem reduced in that condition, But also the burn mosaic, when it's overlain on the flood mosaic, means that patchiness increases. And we know if patchiness increases, biodiversity actually increases. So there's a message of hope there for fire impacts. And I've just mentioned the ponds, super important, and the pondscape is a key component of the beaverscape. And the pondscape is the area not just of the ponds, but the hydrological matrix that runs between the ponds. And experts in pond science want to see a lot more research on pondscapes and rather less on the intricacies of what goes on inside the ponds. The salmonscape has been around for a while, and I think although many of the streams that you work on are not salmon-bearing, there are lessons to be learned from the salmonscape, because the salmonscape in California has been developed through a really nice fusion of art and science as the main communicating tool for raising public awareness of the importance of anadromous fish. And we see this beautiful poster here. And conversely, the science is also interwoven with the art. And in these information posters here, we have a really attractive presentations of why there are connections between salmon and people and society. In Washington State, they've taken a rather different view of what the salmonscape is. This is a website and a major interactive map resource for multiple types of anadromous fish that's used for planning restoration, for monitoring salmon populations, and for informing high school students about the importance of salmon to society. So all of this raises a pretty important question, which is then how are we going to communicate the importance of the beaverscape to people who've no idea what it is or why they should even worry about it? And I'd like to suggest that maybe a song might be another way to do it. I'm no artist, I'm no singer, but song can also be a really great way of communicating ideas. So what I'm hoping now, and this could be a career-ending embarrassment if you don't help me out, is that everybody will stand and we will sing together the connectivity song. Okay, so the song goes to a tune which I think just about everybody in the room will recognize, called Dem Bones. Dem Bones, Dem Bones, dry bones. Only we're not doing them bones, we're doing them scapes. And we're going to talk about them scapes, the geoscapes, the hydroscapes, the bioscapes. We're going to talk about how they're connected. We're going to talk about why that's important. We're going to sing, and we're going to sing about why we do what we do. All right. Everybody ready? So, 1, 2, 3. Them scapes, them scapes, them geoscapes, them scapes, them scapes, them hydroscapes, them scapes, them scapes, them bioscapes, and they all shape the river. The world is connected to the culturescape connected to the naturescape connected to the sunscape connected to the fruitscape connected to the Riverscape connected to the treescape connected to the hydroscape connected to the pondscape connected to the beaverscape connected to the salmonscape, and we're all joined together. Scapes gonna work together, and scapes gonna heal together, and scapes gonna thrive together, and that's how we
to the Beaverscape and beyond.